Welcome to Citrix App Layering, Top 10 Lessons from the Field, version 2 and beyond. So the reason for the title is that this session is actually a follow-up to the one that Rob Zalowski and I did last year with our top 10 lessons from the field. But since then, there have been a lot of new developments in the product, and we've learned a lot of lessons through our various customers that we've been working with ever since. So we wanted to make sure that we shared some of the additional things that we learned since then. And additionally, we wanted to take the opportunity that we're also welcoming Dan Lazar onto the stage with us, the product manager of App Layering, to give you a little bit of an overview of where the products team head is at for the future of App Layering. So just some quick intros for those of you who don't know me. I'm Dan Morgan, a senior architect on our Citrix consulting team based out of Northeast. And this is Rob Zalowski, who requires no introduction. Everyone, please give the man a round of applause, because I guarantee he has answered your forum posts and you have read his blogs.
He only does that to get me to turn purple.
Yeah, it's fun watching Rob turn purple at all these presentations. So anyway, moving along, we're not really going to repeat things from last year where possible, and we're going to keep it primarily focused on new content. We have a packed agenda for you here today. So we're not going to be taking questions during the session, but we'll be around throughout the entirety of the conference. Feel free to stop us in the hallway, ask whatever your questions that you want. And we're all staying at the Marriott, so if you find us at the Marriott bar, you can definitely get some more information from us there after the presentations are over. So this is a lesson that I really wished that we had actually addressed the last time that we were here. How do I know I need app layering? So this is a really important question for those of you who are still early in your journey or looking to embark upon the journey, because using app layering really is an investment, because once you decide to go down that route, you're going to have to do some work to make sure that you get all of your applications into layers and all of your operating system platforms into layers. So the two things to factor in when you're making that decision is, first off, will app layering make your life easier? So a few of the key things to look for, the first one being image sprawl. So the more images you have, the more of an operational benefit that you're going to get from using a product like app layering. Another key one that we're seeing that is driving customers to go this route for valid reasons is if you're looking to shift to a different platform and you don't want to have to essentially double your image count to maintain something, for example, on-prem in vSphere, and also putting additional services in Azure. Additionally, I know that many of the customers in my patch have had use cases that they've wanted to address with non-persistent solutions, but haven't been able to because of, just they were thinking about the image sprawl that would result from having to deal with all the one-off application sets from different user populations that they were looking to address. So this can really help mitigate that. The next question, though, to ask is your organization ready to adopt? So as you all know, app layering requires a non-persistent image management solution. So if you're already using PVS or MCS, great. App layering is going to streamline right into your existing operations. On the other hand, if you're not using PVS or MCS today, that's another journey that you're going to have to embark on as part of this process, which is going to definitely involve some conversations with some of your teams that deal with software deployment and management. So another thing to look out for is to what degree you have your entire build and management process automated. Unfortunately, today we don't have APIs for the Citrix App Layering product, so that may be a little bit more difficult to slipstream into a fully DevOps environment, let's call it, where you have everything from soup to nuts automated, but this is something that Dan may or may not be talking to you about in a little bit. Additionally, we found some obstacles of customers with very rigid image build standards, which we're going to cover in a bit. If you don't do your OS layer the app layering way, you're putting yourself at risk, so you really need to factor this in when determining whether or not to go down this path. And finally, Amazon Web Services, if you're looking to deploy completely in AWS, unfortunately today we don't have an enterprise layer manager appliance for AWS, or we don't have a connector yet either at this point, so you'll face some challenges if you're only going that direction. So at the end of the day, if app layering is going to make your life easier and your organization is ready to adopt, it's definitely a good fit to start moving. On the other hand, if you're looking at your use case and you have 2 XenApp images and that serves out your entire user population, or you're looking at some big organizational barriers on the way that you do automation, that may be a red flag to potentially look in another direction. Again, app layering is a great tool that can be used by a large portion of our customers that we see out there, but if you're not one of them, that's okay. So hopefully that's probably not too many of you here, which is why you're here today. So just want to review some OS layer basics. The reason I'm calling this out again here is simply because we still get a lot of questions about this within the field. Again, this is so important that we needed to just reiterate it again. So the key piece here, start with an ISO installation of Windows and add in your hypervisor tools and capture that as your base OS layer. Store a copy of this forever. Never delete it. If you come away from this session with one thing, it should be that, because that gives you a clean copy that if you run into challenges with your OS layer down the road, that's something that you can always shift back to without putting yourself in a situation where you have to rebuild a bunch of layers, because as you know, application layers are tied to specific OS layers, not operating systems. So if you have to completely start your OS layer from scratch, same with app layers that you had built with that OS layer. So that's something that I can't stress enough to keep in mind there.
So one thing I think is important there, if you're doing a feature update, Windows 10, make sure you make your disk size big enough when you do that. You set the size, make sure you leave 30 gig to do that update. We only in the end store the files that get updated, but that way you'll make sure you have enough room and you don't run out of space when you're doing the upgrade.
Yep, yeah, and that's going to be really important because again, you're going to be doing your Windows 10 feature updates within your Windows 10 OS layer, not creating a new OS layer such that you don't have to rebuild your app layers. All right, something that I'm sure that you all have been chomping at the bit to use or have already started deploying. Since we last spoke, user layers were still in labs, so we didn't really have much to comment there. But since the last time we spoke, they've been GA'd for 64-bit Windows 7 as well as Windows 10. So this is essentially just a read-write elastic layer. So it's mounted at logon, and after that mount process, all writes go to the user layer, not just the writes in the user's context. So really keep that in mind, because on the PVS side, you're hardly going to see your cache getting touched. The next point there is that because of this, all your writes are going to be going out to this disk, so you're going to want to put this on fast storage. We've seen the best success with this being put on flash storage. And of course, you want to make sure it's highly available, because if you lose connectivity to that user layer for any particular reason, in general, that is pretty much going to hose up the entire user session the next time it tries to write anything to it or read something not in system cache already. So note, though, that user layer is great because it opens up some new use cases. Some key ones that we're seeing is using it for storing user profile data, including the OST and the OneDrive cache. Also, user-specific app installs is one of the key pieces that's obviously been touted as part of the functionality. That's great, but again, just knowing that it mounts as the user logs in, not all apps will be compatible, so if going down that direction, just keep that in mind. So again, that actually then ties into the next piece, which for those of you who have used PVD in the past and maybe are still on it, you're going to need to get off it soon. So user layer is one possible approach that you can take as part of that. The key thing to note, though, is that PVD loads much earlier in the stack. So some apps that a user had previously installed within their PVD, in the app layering world, you may actually need to create a layer for that application and then fork that out as a separate layered image there. So another key point there is just that make sure that you're analyzing the applications that you're using as part of this migration. most of PVD's customers that I've seen making this transition were going from Windows 7 to Windows 10 anyway, so it was a good opportunity to do that. But you're definitely going to need to think about this as you make your switch.
One tip there that you can do is if you're wondering if an app will work in the user layer, because it has the elastic layer rules, you can always create a layer out of it and look at the elastic fit. And if it fails the elastic fit, then you're pretty sure that it's not going to work in the user layer either. You'd have to then put it into the image as part of the image.
Yep, and then one key thing to note before I leave this slide here is handling bad user layer contents. So today, there's not a particularly good streamlined process for handling this. And what I mean by bad user contents is when a user installs something that is not going to work within the user layer. So just make sure that you have a strategy for regularly taking backups of the user layers, and ideally a good help desk process to restore from a previous version in the event that your user is allowed to and does something that they're not supposed to. This one we're going to go through pretty quick, but this is particularly important given that app layering is really a CR product. So we've been doing releases nearly on a monthly cadence since we last spoke. So making sure that you're keeping the product up to date when you see a new feature that you want or for a fix that you've been waiting for, this is going to be a key process. So the general procedure to do this, you're going to be downloading your media to your share, going through the ELM upgrade process. One key thing to note, make sure you take a snapshot of your ELM because there's no way to go back otherwise. So make sure you do that before such that you can test everything out. And then that way, if you need to roll back, you have that as a possibility. So once you've upgraded the ELM, at that point, you should be updating your OS layers because each release of app layering is going to come with updated layering tools, which is really the set of scripts and other utilities that that's within the OS. So in the event that you had manually updated some of those scripts for various reasons to accommodate one of your use cases, just make sure that once you run that update, that you actually go back and essentially redo the script updates that you had previously done because it's just going to write over that, obviously. And then once you've got your layering tools up to date, then you're going to be republishing your images, which again is going to accomplish that, and then also make sure you get the filter drive updates in there. Now, another topic that we talked about last time but know a lot more on now, multi-ELM deployments. So why would you do this? Well, the primary reason that we see as being a good reason is depending on where you're packaging and publishing. If you need to package and publish to multiple locations, it's generally good to have a multi-ELM architecture because you can do those operations locally. If you're having to do those over your WAN, they're going to take a lot longer, which can make the admin experience less good within as you're going through that operationally. Other reasons that we've seen that are valid are different admin groups for different images, because while we can delineate roles, we can't say specifically that you can manage this set of layers or this set of images. And then on the other hand, why would you do a single ELM? Essentially, it's much less complex because you don't have to worry about replicating your layers across multiple ELMs. So basically, if you don't have a good reason to have multiple, don't. We see a lot of customers who say they want a separate one for dev, test, and production, but don't actually have a real need for that. So make sure that you're really looking at that. And anyway, so when making this decision process, you'll also know as you start to pilot some of these use cases, because if you're doing a deployment in Azure, for example, you're probably going to start small. And you'll see how long the packaging and publishing is going to take if you're going to be doing that up there to start making that decision.
Yeah, there are some really good use cases for multiple ELMs. We have one customer that's got really low bandwidth, really low, like 100 megabits per second between their data centers. That doesn't work really well to have a single to publish to multiple places. So they deployed ELMs to all of their data centers, right? And that way they can pick which layers they want to push to which data center and keep them in sync that way. They can also have different admins in each data center to handle that security process of who's allowed to see what. So we're going to move on to App Layering in Azure, right? And this is a really important one, especially if you use Azure. You probably know it already, but if you're looking at it, we improved the MCS connector in Azure. In the old connector, we actually ran sysprep on the image when we published it, which means you had to actually bring the image up and get it running in a VM first, right? I wrote a script to help with that, but it took 45 minutes to an hour to do that. It really just added to the process for no reason. We redid the connector so that now it doesn't run sysprep. It publishes the disk to your blob storage, and you just have to use that through MCS, right? So publishing now to Azure is about an hour less than it was before 4.15. That change was made in 4.15 last year, so it's much better. Elm placement with Azure, you have a few options. If you're only using Azure, it's easy. You're going to put your Elm in Azure. That's where it'll be. It'll perform really well doing that. However, if you're doing Azure as kind of DR or Azure as extra capacity, let's say, for your on-prem Elm, which is maybe in XenServer or in vSphere, you'll want to have the Elm in XenServer or vSphere and then publish up to Azure. If you're going to do a single Elm approach, right? The way the tools work will work better that way. It's also probably the way you want to work, right? Because you probably started in the on-premise one to start out with. For that to work well, you need at least a gigabit of bandwidth up to Azure. 10 gig would be better, right? Then you would get normal speed with publishing. If you don't have that, then maybe the multi-Elm design makes sense, right? Where you throw an Elm up in Azure, you then have a share between them, and you can copy your images between those guys up to Azure. You get a few extra things out of having multi-Elm there too that we talked about, different admins, et cetera, if you do that. Okay. Another thing to understand about Azure, if you are doing the kind of on-prem publishing up to Azure, then the Elm needs to be able to communicate to these endpoints in Azure. If it can't communicate them, the API calls and logins, et cetera, won't work. And the Elm doesn't use a proxy. The CentOS won't proxy. So you have to make sure from a network standpoint that you're able to connect to these endpoints when you work with Microsoft to set up your express route, right? So that you know the routing is going to the right place. Otherwise, you won't get the Elm to work between both.
Yeah, I think somebody wrote a blog on that topic, and that blog just so happens to have that same list of things in it.
It does.
Anyway, just another really quick thing to note. What I've seen happen at a lot of customers, as I said before, is that they'll have a large on-prem deployment. They want to dabble in Azure, for example, so they're using their on-prem Elm as part of that. And publishing, when they're doing that initial test, is slow. But if that's your case, don't let that deter you, because again, when you go and do it for real, you're going to want to have one up there in Azure so you can do that publishing locally. And then at that point, you're only going to be syncing the layers as you change them.
Right, and it's pretty quick that way. All right. Switching gears a little, this is an important topic, and we changed this actually just recently, and it's changing again a little, and this is an important change. We're changing the way that we're doing activation of Office with app layering. Office, it's interesting, it's not a tough app to layer, but it's because of the licensing that makes it tough. Office keeps the license for the versions of Office in 2 DAT files that are monitored by the software protection platform, right? That's managed by the system. So when you create a layer, we actually had to figure out how can we get the information from those DAT files to the VDA when you deploy it. So what we actually do is we make a backup of those files when you're creating the layer using the prep command that makes that. And then we have to get those 2 files onto the VDA as the licensing files for Office when it's there. And the way we used to do that was we had a script, and it would, on boot, monitor the software protection platform. When the software protection platform stopped running, because it runs automatically, we would copy those files. Sometimes it never stopped. So that would cause problems where when your users would launch Office, wouldn't activate because it didn't really know Office was installed because it had the wrong DAT files, and you would get reconfiguring, and it would try to reconfigure Office, and then maybe it would work, and you get a lot of help desk calls. So what we do instead now is we still do the backup, but when we publish the image, we automatically insert those files right into the image so that we don't have to do that process on boot up. Right? So it's a much more reliable way to do it. Truthfully, it's the way we should have done it in the first place. Now, how do you implement that now that it's out? So assuming you already have Office running and you're not new to this, you're going to add a version to your OS layer. You're going to do what Dan said, which is update, we call them the gold image tools, but the scripts that are part of the layer, so you have them in there. Finalize that. Maybe you do it when you do Windows updates, right? So they go together. And then you use that version of the OS to add a version to your Office layer. Now, what happens when you add a version to your Office layer, the version of those dat files is wrong because you added a version so it didn't get updated. So you need to open Office and run it. That'll actually run the reconfigure. It'll put that version into those files. Then you run the prep script, which will back it up, and we're putting them in a different location now, putting them under Program Files Unidesk. So that'll put those files there. And then importantly, you need to remove the old ones that were backed up there. So that's that path, Windows System 32 App Store to backup from Layer. And if you delete those, then our scripts will not try to copy over when they do that part, right? That'll skip that whole copy over part. And the last thing you want to do in this process is rearm Office again, which you don't normally have to do when you add a version, but because you ran it to change those files, then you want to rearm it to make sure it gets rearmed, right? So it's not really tough. You do that, save the layer, and when you republish the image, you'll have this much more reliable mechanism to get Office activated than what you had before. Okay. Couple things on elastic layering that are new. First one's a big one. Everyone's concerned with login times. Elastic layering adds a lot of time to login times is what it's thought. So we actually changed that. Now, by default, elastic layers are mounted kind of simultaneously and they don't stop the login. So you log in, that goes separately. The layers get mounted in their time and go on to make logins faster. There's still a little bit more login time, right? Just the way it works, but it's not a lot of time. It's a little bit of time. So the big issue here is that's a change, right? So if you were running elastic layering before, this changed in 4.14. So when you upgrade to 4.14 or later, this just changes and becomes the default. That means you really need to test well because, excuse me, some applications might not work with this method. They might have to be mounted before the login to actually work. Anything that's auto-launched, you know, where you have a scheduled task or a logon script that launches it, you need to make sure that it mounts beforehand, and we have a way to do that, which is called compatibility mode. Basically, you edit the layer, you go into the app layering settings, and you click the enable compatibility mode, and that will tell it to do it the old way, right, and launch it the old way. Okay. I talked about this, so make sure you test. It's really important when you do this migration, all your layers. Okay. Next thing to talk about is troubleshooting, right? And this, I'd say on the forums that I answer questions on is probably one of the top things that there are questions on, right? My elastic layering isn't working properly, why isn't it working? The biggest thing here is to go into Program Data Unidesk logs folder. There's a log file in there that has incredible detail nitty-gritty about what elastic layering is happening. You'll see things like the login time of the user, the mount time of all the apps, whether it mounts an app or doesn't, or skips an app, and finish times, any errors. And you know, things will look like this. Hey, I'm logging in for this user. I'm mapping these layers, or I'm not mounting these layers for whatever reason I'm doing that. You know, I got an error, I couldn't mount the layer, right? And hopefully some information on why I couldn't do that. If not, at least it tells you got to go and look and see what was going on with that layer. But that log is the most important thing in troubleshooting elastic layers. The next thing is the file share, right? What's happening with your file share. And app layering, when we're mounting a layer, we're really just doing the exact same thing you would do if you went to the share, right-click, and said mount. So you can do that, right? That's a good test. Can I go to the share? Can I right-click on one of the layer files and say mount? Or do I get an error from Windows when I do that? Usually it's a permission. Quite often, most of the time, these are either permission problems or DNS problems, but mostly it's permission problems that cause problems with the share. You do also want to make sure that there's a set of JSON files that define who gets what layers in app layering. You need to make sure those are there. If they aren't there, it's not going to drive the rest of all this process for that. But one other thing there that I kind of missed was also you want to make sure that you enable elastic layering in your image template so that it's turned on, right? That's another big one. Lastly, for user layers, permissions on the share are a little different, but they're the exact same permissions you would use on a home drive, right? So if you have set up a home drive where the creator owner gets rights to all the files underneath, and then you give admin rights to everything, that's the way that you set up the user layer as well, usually. Okay.
So just a few quick things to note there as well. When you're in the process of upgrading from a pre-4.14 version to a post-4.14 version, if you don't have time to thoroughly test each of your app layers in advance, there's actually a registry key where you can change the behavior on the layered image such that it mounts all elastic layers. in that compatibility mode, so it loads it before the logon proceeds, which could give you some time to publish a test image that doesn't have that registry key set, and then you could go through safely each of your layers without having to worry about disrupting normal operations as part of that purpose.
Right, which is definitely something if you don't have the time, right? But you do want to test them one way or the other, right? A couple other things about elastic layering, right? The system has to reboot. When you're using elastic layers, the system has to reboot on logout, right? The way that the layers get removed is not because the user logged out, it's because the machine reboots. Once they're attached, they're attached. So, that's the default for a non-persistent VDI. Some people want to use static. You can use static, but you can't have it, you have to have it reboot on logout, right? And as part of that. We do get, when we're using elastic layering, our systems are slow or sluggish, right? They're not working the same. So there is a performance hit to using elastic layers. It's usually pretty small, not a noticeable thing. It might be most noticeable when you first open an application, that it takes a little longer to launch because we have to load things a little differently there. And then the second time you loaded it, it would be fast, right? But the performance of the application shouldn't really be any different with app layering. It doesn't add that type of stuff. So what you want to look at there is what kind of storage you're using. Is it fast enough? Generally, you do this stuff on flash storage, but if you're not, it matters. If it's user layer, it really kind of has to be flash storage, right? It's not going to work well on non-flash storage because all the writes with the user layer go into that, right? So be aware of that one. The other thing is if you have a layer that has an extremely large registry, that doesn't work well elastically because we can't load the whole thing into memory, so it's kind of swapping out if there's a lot of calls. So if you have Office is an example, 500,000 registry entries, or Visual Studio, things like that, you put them in the image and they work much better than as an elastic layer, right? If you're using the user layer and you have a failure of an install, then the user has to go and kind of clear that out the next time it boots. Let's say they didn't know they installed something with a kernel driver. It's not going to work, right? They'll have to do an uninstall when it reboots, when they find out it's not working. But if you need something to be deleted so that you can see files underneath it from the user layer, you can't just delete them. You can't go in and delete them because it will remember the deletes. What you can do is mount the user layer on another machine and delete them, then we won't remember the deletes, right? We won't keep track of those as deletes. So you can actually remove them like they were never there, as opposed to actively deleting something where we're actually going to remember that it was deleted and mark that. So you won't see the file that is in a layer underneath the user layer, which are, of course, all the other layers on the image. And the last thing there for user layers, don't delete the profile and log off for obvious reasons, right? It's going to delete the profile out of the user layer, right? We don't want to do that. MCS, right? This one, another one that generates a lot of things out on the forums. What we usually see is we get rearms to fail, right, sometimes. And almost all the time what it turns out to is a time sync problem with the published master image when it comes up. And what happens is if you don't use a template, there's actually been a VM with the time zone set. The virtual BIOS has UTC as its time zone. So when that machine boots up, it thinks UTC is the time zone, but you're in a different time zone, so it's always 4 or 5 hours off. Therefore, the MCS process can't log into the machine and the rearm fails. What you really need to do is take your gold image that you started with, that was a VM and has the right BIOS and all that, clone that and use that as your template, configure it however you want your machines to be configured. And then when you deploy your master image with that template, it'll all work okay, right? You won't have to worry about that. Still worth disabling MCS's rearms, I think, because there's no need to do that with app layering. That's a non-app layering thing. We rearm in the layer, and then we rearm Windows automatically, right, on boot. So for there, you can use commands either by catalog or for the whole DDC. And these are the commands to disable rearms, right? If you do them by catalog, and this will all be posted, right? So you don't have to like write these down. This is if you do it by DDC, right? And the advantage there is if you do that, you won't get any of those rearm errors either way, right? And the time sync thing doesn't actually matter on the VMs. It only matters for the process of creating them. One bad thing is this whole rearm thing in Citrix Cloud, the SDK doesn't include those commands, like for you to run remotely. So you'll just have to live with the error, but it'll all work fine when you go to use it. Okay. One last thing, I always like to talk about testing. It's one of my favorite discussion points, right? Because I think it's one of the most important things, not just for app layering, but period with Citrix. App layering doesn't isolate applications like AppV does, right? So that's on purpose, right? We want all the applications to work easily with each other, which they do. But it does mean because we are creating these in isolation that you really do have to worry about them conflicting if they might do that, right? And what that means is that you have to test them well, right? You can't just say, I'm gonna make a little change to a layer, and since it was just a little change, I'm gonna roll it out to production right away and not worry about that. The problem is in app layering, we don't capture what a process is doing. We capture everything that happens on the packaging machine when it happens. Sometimes you get stuff you didn't intend to get and things don't work. So you have to test. You always have to test no matter how small the difference is. One thing you can do is you can test as an elastic layer, right? That makes it easier. You don't have to push up an image and do all that stuff. You just have to assign the elastic layer to testers and say, go test it. It's only good for smoke testing unless you're using elastic layers. You still need to, if you're gonna include that in an image, as your next test, publish it as an image, have the app owners test it. App owners don't always test so well either, right? So I really like the last kind of bullet here, which is either, I call it pre-prod or canary testing, right? That's where you take your image that you're gonna roll out to everyone, you don't roll it out to everyone. You roll it out to 10 to 20% of your environment first. You let that cook for, let's say your reboots are on the weekend, right? So let that cook for a week. Have 10 to 20% extra capacity, so the worst that happens is you start to get calls, you just put those machines in maintenance mode, everybody moves over to the rest of the machines, right? And then you go fix your problem and do it again. Your next weekend, you roll out to the other 80 or 90%. You're pretty certain now, because it's really been used, that it's gonna work okay. And then you start the other process over again. If I have changes, right, I roll that to the 10 to 20, and you just keep rolling that way. It's a very successful way to roll tests out, to really know what's happening with your images. And I think it'll keep everybody much happier in every environment, right? And by the way, I recommend that at every Citrix customer. It has nothing to do with app layering. Right?
Yep. One really quick thing to add there is that while app layering does not isolate apps in the way that AppV does, elastic layers, the reads are isolated from each other when we're talking about multiple users on a XenApp server as an example. However, any of the writes to any common files you might have between two applications would be going for the same place that is not per user. So may it be possible to have different versions of the same application, as an example, on the same XenApp server used by separate user communities? Yes, it may be possible, but you'd have to test because it depends on whether those are writing to files that could be potentially shared.
Right. All right, so now we're going to change gears a bit, a little less technical, a little more what's going on. And Dan Lazar, our Doctor Who, is going to take us to the future of app layering.
Thanks, Rob. Another round of applause for this guy. Come on.
Thanks, Evan.
I like to see him turn purple also. So the future of app layering. Actually, before we get to the future, I want to go back a little bit. So as was mentioned earlier, we release app layering roughly on a monthly cadence. So I'm going to go back and talk briefly about the last couple releases we've had, so in case you guys haven't been aware of what we've been doing. So in between version 1902 and 1903 of the product, we did make some improvements in the area of performance, specifically with the Hyper-V connector that we added to the product last year. We've really been working hard to optimize performance in the product overall, and this has we've been getting some good results out of by decreasing our app layer creation times there. We are continuously working to improve platform support with app layering, and we've added, within the 1902 release, we added support for Windows 10 version 1809 as an app layer, or as an OS layer. We did release a new Azure connector for Azure Gov, and we are now supporting layering appliances running on Server 2019 Hyper-V. We've made some usability improvements to the product. The ability to package and publish on Hyper-V 2019 hosts as part of the Hyper-V connector work we're doing. And we've been continuously improving security in the product by adding TLS 1.2 support for LDAP querying. And then coming real soon, we're hoping in the next week or two, we'll be releasing 1905. There are additional platform enhancements that are coming in version 1905. We will be adding Server 2019 as an OS layer. We will be also adding Office 2019 as an app layer. We will be officially supporting Virtual Apps and Desktops 1903 current release and the LTSR 715 cumulative update 4 and provisioning services 1903. We are also continuously, as I said, improving the connector behaviors for Hyper-V. We're changing the behavior here to provide progress as a percentage as opposed to elapsed time, which is a little bit easier to work with. And then on the security side, we're adding TLS support for email notifications that get sent from the appliance. So that's all coming very soon. So now the future of app layering. So as you look here, I want you to kind of think back to what Dan had said earlier around app layering as an investment. So we talk to customers all the time, and we believe truly in the value add that app layering has, but we do understand that there's an investment that goes into adopting the technology. So really, when we're talking about priorities for app layering coming this year and into next year, we're really trying to focus on two areas that really try to directly target that investment that you guys are making in trying to utilize this technology. And that's really around integration and around automation. These are two characteristics in the product that we feel are where there's some limitations that prevent people from really fully adopting the technology. And as I said, we really believe that it's worth adopting, so we want to address those. So the first one I want to talk about here is a new feature we're calling the user personalization layer for Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops. So this is a feature that's currently in a very early preview. And essentially what we're doing here is we are taking the user layer technology that currently exists in the app layering product, and we're kind of integrating that directly into Virtual Apps and Desktops. So this is going to be a new feature of Virtual Apps and Desktops. It's a feature which gets deployed along with the VDA when you install it. The driver components that enable the user layer will be part of the VDA. And the configuration that you can apply to define the repositories where the user layer is attached will be something that you can configure from CVAT and Studio as well. This is initially, or originally, we were positioning this as a functional replacement for PVD, because we know, as was said previously, there's a lot of customers out there who really are still relying on PVD or are still looking for a user personalization or user persistence technology that really works for them. We are targeting this feature for that, but really it's also a next generation feature. This feature will not require the deployment of a layering appliance to utilize it. It will still require a repository on a Windows file share in the environment where the VDAs are running. But again, it's configurable through Studio ultimately. And what's really cool is it fully supports non-persistent pooled catalogs, which PVD of course does not. Fully supports Windows 10, has the full capabilities that the full user layer feature has in app layering today. But it's really a direct integration into CVAT, and therefore we hope will be easier to adopt for customers who haven't been really able to do that forklift to the app layering product solution. So that's pretty exciting. We are also, as you guys probably heard at the keynote, there's a great interest all around the company for supporting Microsoft's new Windows Virtual Desktop solution in Azure. As part of that, we have a mandate within app layering to have day one support for Windows 10 EVD as well. And then on the automation topic, so this one's also pretty exciting. We're working on a full scope layering management API. It's an API that's hosted in Citrix Cloud, but compatible with your on-prem layering appliances. And when we release it, the goal here is to enable the full automation of the layering management tasks that, from talking to our customers, talking to you guys, that we found are that can be a struggle for shops who are heavily dependent on automation. Initially, it will be releasing with basic layering management capabilities, so the ability to create new app layers, the ability to create new app layer versions, the ability to publish new app layers and things like that. We will be continuously working on this API to improve it. We'll be expanding the scope of it. And ultimately, this API is going to drive a lot of the future work we do in app layering around making app layering more of a consumption service for the rest of our Citrix product technologies.
I asked for that 10 years ago. That's so exciting.
So you'll also be excited to know that before the end of this year, we're hoping in the Q3 timeframe, we'll be releasing an early tech preview for the API as well that you guys can sign up for and try out. So that's pretty cool. And then lastly, and this kind of ties into really the other two themes around automation and integration is we're hard at work building a new architecture, a new highly scalable and performant architecture for app layering. This is in an effort to get the product to scale better than it has previously and to allow it to more natively operate in cloud environments and any environment where we may target it in the future. So look for, we're initially targeting these enhancements in Hyper-V because from a technological standpoint, it's the easier platform or the quicker platform for us to deploy, but this architecture is going to follow through into all of the platforms that we support with app layering. So keep an eye out on that too. And then if you guys have a chance this week, we are actually demoing the preview of the user personalization layer. So if you guys head over to the Citrix Experience Center, you can take a look here on the slide. There's a demo booth that we have, and one of our app layering engineers is running the demo this week. I definitely encourage you to go check it out and ask him all the questions that you have about the product and about this feature. So, and that pretty much wraps us up. There's a few other sessions that we have available this week that we encourage you guys to check out. And then lastly here, if you enjoyed this session and if this was valuable for you, please give us a rating. We like 7s, right guys?
7s.
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 7s. And that's it. Thanks everybody. Thanks for coming.
Appreciate it.